Of our program, from documentaries to science. Listen and download at any time by going to bbcworldservice.com. On air, online and on smartphone.
This is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
Welcome to Newshour from the BBC World Service. I'm Paul Henley. Get off the fence and choose between good and evil, Ukraine's president tells Israeli MPs through an interpreter.
One could ask and ask why we cannot receive arms from you, or why Israel did not implement powerful sanctions against Russia.
As the fierce siege of the Ukrainian port city continues, we hear one woman's harrowing story of escape from Mariupol.
The city is turning into cemetery. If you're not killed by the shelling, then you would die of hunger or because there's no water.
And a pro-Russian MP in Ukraine gives us his reaction to his party being suspended. Also on the programme, why climate scientists say unseasonably mild temperatures in the Antarctic should ring alarm bells for us all. That's all after the news.
Hello, this is the BBC News with Fiona MacDonald. The United Nations Refugee Agency says 10 million Ukrainians have now fled their homes because of the war, describing the speed and scale of the displacement as unprecedented in recent decades. The refugees have either left the country or sought shelter elsewhere within Ukraine. Danny Eberhard reports.
Russia's invasion and the 3.5 weeks of war since has uprooted about a quarter of Ukraine's population. Nearly 3.5 million Ukrainians, the vast majority women and children, have fled abroad. Overwhelmingly, they've headed west to countries including Poland, Romania and Moldova. But almost twice that number are internally displaced, leaving conflict zones for other comparatively safer parts of Ukraine. The UN warns the situation could deteriorate still further. It says 13 million people in the areas hardest hit by fighting are in need of protection and humanitarian assistance.
There's been no let-up in fighting in the southern Ukrainian city of Mariupol, which Russian forces have been blockading for weeks. Hundreds of people are believed to be trapped in shelters below destroyed buildings there. Wera Davis reports from Dnipro.
Russia has denied attacking civilian buildings inside Mariupol, but with an estimated 90% of structures destroyed or damaged by shelling, such denials are barely credible. The latest unconfirmed reports from the city say an art school where at least 400 people were seeking shelter was hit and destroyed. There's been no word on casualties, but the school is very close to the city's theatre, which was attacked and almost completely flattened last week. There were thought to be more than 1,000 people inside at the time. Apart from around 130 confirmed survivors, heavy shelling in the area has prevented rescue teams getting inside the rubble to locate other victims.
President Volodymyr Zelensky has told the Israeli parliament that Ukraine, like Israel, was facing the threat of utter destruction and asked why it wasn't providing his country with air defense weapons that could protect it against Russia. Israel has so far tried to remain a neutral mediator. Yolande Nell has this report.
In his virtual international tour, President Zelensky has proven skillful at adapting his message to different groups of lawmakers. Speaking to Israel's parliament on a Zoom video conference, he began by echoing the words of the former Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir, who was born in Kiev. We intend to live, but our neighbours want to see us dead. Mr. Zelensky, who is Jewish, also compared the actions and words of Russia to those of Nazi Germany in the Second World War. And then he asked why Israel, which has sent humanitarian aid, was not sending ammunition and hadn't imposed sanctions on Moscow in line with many Western countries.
You're listening to the latest world news live from London. The deputy commander of Russia's Black Sea Fleet, Captain Andrei Pali, has been killed in Mariupol. His death was confirmed by the governor of Sevastopol in Crimea, which was annexed by Ukraine in 2014. He's the first high-ranking Russian naval officer to be confirmed dead in Ukraine, but other sources have reported the deaths of 5 Russian generals since the invasion in late February. The US has condemned the latest attack by the Iranian-backed Houthi movement on targets in Saudi Arabia, which included several facilities belonging to the oil giant Aramco. Our Arab Affairs editor Sebastian Usher reports.
A fire broke out in a tank at a petroleum product distribution centre in Jeddah, but is now reportedly under control. Another missile caused a temporary cut in production at a refinery in Yanbu. These strikes against the economic foundation of Saudi Arabia have been occurring increasingly regularly, but have yet to cause any major disruption. They will, however, draw greater concern as world leaders try to encourage Saudi Arabia to boost its oil production as a possible means of limiting the economic damage from the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
The Philippine Electoral Commission says it's considering how to proceed after the front-runners in both the presidential and vice-presidential elections in May skipped the first televised debate. The daughter of the current Philippine leader and leading vice-presidential candidate, Sara Duterte, failed to turn up on Sunday. Ms. Duterte's running mate for president missed his debate on Saturday. The descendants of South Africa's earliest inhabitants have welcomed a court ruling halting the construction of the tech giant Amazon's new Africa headquarters on land they consider sacred. A judge ruled that the rights of the Khoi and San peoples were under threat. Amazon planned to build on a site in Cape Town where two rivers meet. BBC News.
Hello and welcome to Newshour from the BBC World Service, coming to you live from London. I'm Paul Henley. The Israeli National Parliament has become the audience for the latest in a series of emotional video appeals for international support by the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. Addressing MPs of the Knesset, Mr. Zelensky said that Ukraine, like Israel, faced the threat of utter destruction and asked why Israel wasn't providing his country with air defense weapons. He said the time had come for Israel to make a choice, to drop neutrality and to forget any idea of mediating between good and evil. He's heard here in English through a translator.
I don't need to convince you to what extent our histories are intertwined, the history of Ukrainians and Jewish people in the past and now, in this terrible time. We are in different countries. We are absolutely in different conditions. However, the threat is the same for you and me. For you and us, total destruction of people, culture, state, and even the name of Ukraine.
Mr. Zelensky asked why Israel wasn't doing more to help.
One could ask and ask why we cannot receive arms from you, or why Israel did not implement powerful sanctions against Russia to affect Russian business. But the decision is yours, brothers and sisters, and you will have to live with that answer. Ukrainians 80 years ago were saving Jews.
Well, our correspondent in Jerusalem is Yolande Nell. Did she see this as a heartfelt appeal?
It was, and quite sort of short and punchy, and we saw once again how President Zelensky is just so good at targeting his message to his audience. So really, the words he chose will have struck a chord, I think, with the Israeli lawmakers, with the Israeli psyche. And he began quite early on by quoting Golda Meir, who he said was a Ukrainian. Of course, she was born in Kiev. The former Israeli Prime Minister said words to the effect of, "We would like to live, but our neighbours want to see us dead." That doesn't leave much room for compromise. And from then on, he kept returning to the theme of how the history of Ukraine and Israel, the histories were intertwined, Jewish histories were intertwined. Of course, Mr. Zelensky himself is Jewish, and that was how he kind of built up to his point, saying, "I'm sure you share and feel our pain," and basically questioning the Israeli official position of either ambivalence or neutrality. And he asked, why can't you send ammunition? Israel has sent 100 tons of humanitarian aid, but it has been reluctant to get more involved in terms of any kind of military assistance, even when Ukraine has been asking for things like flak jackets and helmets. Unlike most Western countries, Israel has not taken the decision to join sanctions on Russia. And so really leaving them with quite a strong position on where Ukraine stands.
Hard to tell because MPs were attending virtually, but what would you say was the reaction that he got?
Some of it will be very uncomfortable. As you say, it was a strange sort of setup because the Israeli parliament is officially in recess at the moment. There's renovation work in the Knesset building. This was in the form of a sort of a Zoom call with lots of the lawmakers joining, obviously, from home or some of them even from overseas. And there has been a lot of questioning of how long Israel can stick with this sort of schizophrenic position where you have the foreign minister and the alternate prime minister, Yair Lapid, repeatedly denouncing Russia's actions. But the prime minister has pointedly not condemned the Russian invasion of Ukraine. He has set himself up as a mediator, flying to see President Putin, taking multiple calls from the Ukrainian and Russian leaders. He said it's his moral duty to continue with these mediation efforts, but it's well known within Israel that it's protecting its own interests in the Middle East as well. It simply does not want to antagonize Russia because Israel has, by Russia, been given a kind of free hand to attack any Iranian and Hezbollah forces in Syria next door, so long as it doesn't affect Russian troops.
As our correspondent in Jerusalem, Yolande Nell. Ksenia Svetlova is a political analyst, Russian-born, and a former member of the Israeli parliament. She joins me live from Tel Aviv. Welcome, Ksenia. What was your reaction to Mr. Zelensky's address?
Well, I thought that it's a very emotional and very important speech because this is a Ukrainian Jewish president speaking to the leaders and to the lawmakers of the only democracy in the Middle East, a Jewish and democratic state of Israel. So everything in it was symbolic. There were a lot of historical analogies that were made. Some of them were not very acceptable to the Israeli ear. This is clear from the reactions of most of MPs that have written already on their Facebook and Twitter that they do not agree to some facts that were mentioned by President Zelensky. But I thought what is most, tragic about this speech is that it will not make a difference. Unfortunately, not in the Israeli official policy towards the war in Ukraine. There will be no weapon sales, there will be no sanctions, at least not for now, and that there will be not even more quota for the refugees that are officially even not recognized in Israel as refugees.
You talked about some MPs disagreeing with some of the president's points. At one stage, he said that Ukraine saved Jews during the last World War. That might have raised eyebrows, even though they were words spoken by a Jew.
Yes, absolutely, because unfortunately, the anti-Semitism of Ukrainians during the World War II, before that, the pogroms and the violence that Jews had suffered on the hands of Ukrainians. In Israel, it's notorious, it's well known. Many people are coming from this part of the world. So many had taken to this point as the most important focal point of the whole speech, missing what I think should be the most important message. Ukraine is no longer wants for Israel to mediate between itself and between Russia. It doesn't see a point, it doesn't believe that this mediation can succeed. And Zelensky spoke about it clearly. He said that there is no mediation between the good and the evil. If you remember well that he asked for Israel to mediate between Moscow and Kiev, which Israel did, but 2 weeks had passed since then. Many people died, and the targets and the civilian population became a prime target for the Israeli army. So that's why perhaps we hear from him today that no more mediation. You have to take the right decision. You have to stand for what is right today. That's what I heard from his speech.
You think that nothing will change in the wake of the speech. Can you explain why it's in Israel's national interest not to alienate Russia completely?
Well, first of all, I do not believe that the decision to hang on by neutrality it's dictated only from strategic interests of Israel. There is, of course, the major concern that Israel will not be able to act anymore against Iranian and Hezbollah targets in Syria because Russia is dominating the airspace in this part of the world, both in Syria and, by the way, also in Lebanon. But I have to remind you that back in 2014, when Russia was still not involved in the Syrian war, Israel declined to condemn Russia for annexing Crimea. And this was 1 year before the Israeli involvement. So I think that this is more about traditional Israeli position. It's more clinging to the realpolitik over concerns of human rights, morale, and things like that.
Thank you.
It usually stands for promoting more ties with as much countries as usual, and even if these countries are obviously not democratic, also in the midst of the very vicious war that is right now launched against Ukrainians.
Ksenia Svetlova from Tel Aviv, a former member of the Israeli parliament. Many thanks. Now, Ukrainian officials say an art school in the besieged city of Mariupol has been hit by Russian missiles. There's been no independent confirmation of that attack, but Mariupol Council said 400 people have been sheltering there. Reports coming out of the city continue to describe apocalyptic scenes with huge damage, no basic utilities, and no access for humanitarian aid because of the constant shelling. And now there are claims that civilians have been forcibly taken into Russian territory. I've been talking about Mariupol to an advisor at the office of the Ukrainian president. She's Tatiana Lomakina, and she started by telling me what the latest was from the southern city.
The situation in Mariupol, unfortunately, remains very difficult. 90% of buildings have been damaged. We don't know how many people remain under the rubble, which cannot be picked apart due to constant shelling. And Mariupol's strategy of fighting is like Aleppo. According to the Mariupol City Council information, in the left side of the city, Russian bombers dropped bombs on the children's art school today. 400 Mariupol residents in shelters. Women, children, elderly people.
The Russians say there were also militia fighters in the premises. Do you know that that's not the case?
If we try to explain the situation with theater, about 1,000 people were in shelter. It's about civilian people.
Do you know for sure that there were not members of the Azov brigade, as Russia said, were in the building? Do you know that they weren't present?
We communicate with a representative of Mariupol City Council, and they communicate with a representative of the city, with people, and they say it's not true.
Is it still possible for civilians to get out of Mariupol? What's happening?
Of the 400,000 inhabitants of the city, and only 40,000 Mariupol residents were able to evacuate to Ukrainian territory. And we have not good situation with the deportation of people who hid in shelters, possibly to the Russian Federation. First, we received calls from people who saw it. Then we started post calls from victim people. From their story, we can say that yes, it's happened. Ukrainian law enforcement agencies and human rights ombudsman are currently working on this situation now.
So civilians have been taken to Russian territory. You know that for sure. Do you know what's happened to them?
People say that they can have the document, that they can't have the telephone because Russian soldiers not give them after checking. That's why people without documents now directed to the different Russian cities by train.
Tatiana Lomakina, advisor to Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky, and later in the program we'll hear from a woman who managed to escape Mariupol earlier this week. You're listening to the BBC World Service live from London. This is Newshour. Coming up, the messaging app Telegram is popular in Russia and Ukraine. We ask, is it a secure mode of communicating sensitive material at a time of war?
Telegram has said that they have not handed over any information to the Russian government, but they have not provided any kind of evidence. They don't have a history of transparency. Even that claim doesn't address the concerns about a security breach or insider threat.
The headlines: the United Nations says 10 million Ukrainians have now been displaced by the invading Russian forces and have either fled abroad or moved to safer parts of the country. And the battle for the city of Mariupol is continuing, with thousands trapped without food or water, while the city is under near constant bombardment. This is Paul Henley with Newshour, live from the BBC. Romania lies just around the Black Sea coast, anti-clockwise from Ukraine. Half the 900,000 people who usually live in the city of Odessa are already estimated to have left the city, and one way they leave the country is across the Danube by river ferry. Nick Thorpe watched them arrive and crossed the river himself, with some of a small number going against the flow.
As the river ferry docks at Isacha, the Romanian fire brigade rush forward to help the new arrivals from Ukraine ashore. Blankets are thrown around the shoulders of the elderly or women with small babies. Volunteers help carry the passengers' luggage. 3 weeks into this war, the Romanian relief effort is swift and well organized. With so many crossing from Ukraine to Romania, the small number going the other way from Romania to Ukraine pass almost unnoticed. A ferry ticket costs just €1 for a foot passenger. In the waiting room, 2 women told me why they're going back.
I'm going back because my son is there. Also because of my daughter, who became a volunteer. She's filling sandbags to defend Odessa.
Are you not afraid to be going back?
No. We're not going back to be afraid. On the contrary, we're going back to raise the spirits, to protect our land.
In the small cabin on the ferry, I meet another woman, Irina. She left Kiev once already to drive with her twin 11-year-olds to safety in Dortmund. Then she drove all the way back here, 2,300 kilometers, to fetch her mother, who lives in Odessa. Friends are driving her to Orlivka, the ferry terminal on the Ukrainian side of the Danube.
I have happy life in Ukraine. My native language is Russian, but I don't want Putin to protect me. I don't know his protection. Ukraine was a great country, but now everything is ruined, and I don't know will stay my house in safety. I don't know when I can come back to Ukraine.
After an hour moored to the shore here, a line of cars and trucks and 2 buses full of children are allowed onto the ferry first. Then Irina and her mother, Natalia, join a crowd of several hundred Ukrainians coming down the ramp onto the ferry. That's the sound of their luggage.
This is my mother. I'm happy that I met my mother. She was crying that she thinks that we'll never see each other again.
It's all too much for Natalia in her pink anorak. She can't speak. The ferry leaves. The refugees crowd the deck.
This river crossing across the river Danube is the only water crossing between Ukraine on the far shore and Romania here. The people, mostly women and children, they've come here to this ferry crossing from all over southern Ukraine, perhaps from beyond. It's a very cold day. We just had some flakes of snow falling down here. And as they cross to safety in Romania, their thoughts as they reach safety themselves between one world at war and another world of peace are with those they've left behind in Ukraine. That was the BBC's Nick Thorpe reporting. Now, Ukraine Ukraine's president has suspended 11 pro-Russia parties. While the country is under martial law, Volodymyr Zelensky warned that those collaborating with Moscow would face a firm response. He's also ordered all of Ukraine's television news channels to broadcast a single stream of news. One of Ukraine's biggest opposition platforms in parliament in Kiev, the For Life group, has condemned the move. I've been talking to Oleg Voloshin, an MP for that party.
This is absolutely a legal decision that I believe and misunderstand it. Misunderstand it because my perception as a citizen of Ukraine, a country undergoing a terrible war and with citizens suffering from this war right now, the last thing we need in these challenging times is sowing discord among Ukrainians and pinpointing who is good, who is bad, who is more greater patriot, who is less patriot. So that's something we couldn't have expected from President Zelensky, given the challenges the country sees leading facing.
Why do you think he's done this?
So there is no surprise that Mr. Zelensky had troubles with us because we used to be the leading opposition force in our country. But on the other hand, other reason is that he now, with, let's be frank, lack of prospects of the conflict ending quite soon, and especially with the lack of prospects with the conflict ending with the outright victory of Ukraine, he is now trying to search for the internal enemies to explain what he's doing in general.
Is it wrong then, or is it simplistic to describe your party as a pro-Russian party?
To be true, we are as pro-Russian in this case, right?
Apart from wanting to stop the war, you're not pro-Russian.
So we wanted to avert the war through dialogue and reconciliation with Russia and through stopping conflict in Donbass. That we do believe, without having been solved, this conflict at the end of the day resulted in a bigger war. So let's not forget that the military action on the territory of Ukraine has been taking place for 8 years already. And our party, yes, we stood for Russian language community. Yes, we stood for for reconciliation with Russia. Yes, we opposed the idea of joining NATO, but we never supported any destructive actions on the side of Russia. Moreover, since the aggression started, and we do call it aggression, we do call it invasion.
You call it a war. You call it all that. It's not a military operation.
Yes, we call it a war. Absolutely. So do
you see Crimea as Ukrainian?
Definitely, our party has never declared any other position. On the other hand, we don't see any military solution to the Crimean issue as well as to this issue. So our conviction has always been that peace is already a victory. Even today, the majority of Ukrainians, they want this terrible bloodshed just stop. Because it's impossible, technically impossible nowadays to get an outright military victory over Russia. So the only thing we can achieve is to stop the bloodshed and to find some reconciliation, to find some agreement.
It would be very strange, wouldn't it, for a country that was at war with Russia not to take action against political parties inside Ukraine that were seen as pro-Russian. That would be odd.
At the end of the day, what is the reason about? So first and foremost, as Britain is a good example. During the Second World War, you never cancelled an election. So a democratic nation to a challenge like this responds not with land but with war freedom.
What's your response to the fact that the US accused you of working on behalf of Russian intelligence services to destabilize Ukraine in advance of the Russian invasion?
That's exactly the typical approach, unfortunately sometimes displayed by our Western partners, providing no evidence of any direct cooperation, witting cooperation. I can claim that I had never wittingly met in my life with any person who I knew used to be a representative of Russian security service.
Is it true that the leader of your party has a daughter whose godfather is Vladimir Putin?
Yes, that's true, but what's about that? So
it does suggest links, doesn't it?
Yes, it does suggest links, but this link allows us to be a party that heavily lobbied for reconciliation, and that, should you be listened to, Ukraine and Russia are doomed to be neighbors. They need to find a way together, even after this war ends. Because I don't believe that at the end of this war, Russia will disappear. It's just impossible.
Oleg Voloshin from the opposition Platform for Life party in Ukraine. This is NewsHour from the BBC World Service.